լավ։ Բարև ձեզ։ Բարի գալուս TUMO ստեղծարար տեխնոլոգիաների կենտրոն, շնորհակալություն, որ եկել եք։ Այսօրվա դասախոսությունը կարդալու է Արա Շիրինյանը, ով եկել է ԱՄՆ-ից, Արիզոնա նահանգի Ֆենիքս քաղաքից, եւ ով TUMO ստեղծարար տեխնոլոգիաների կենտրոնում վարում է 2 շաբաթյա դասընթաց խաղերի դիզայն թեմայով։ Խնդրում եմ դիմավորեք։
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Ara Shirinyan. Before we start, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and my background. I went to school for computer science at the University of Maryland. I've been a game designer professionally since 2004. Some of my personal interests include human-computer interaction and user psychology. Here are a few games that I have worked on. And right now my current project is I'm working with a company in Phoenix called WePlay.media, and we're working on the official Motogp mobile game. So what I want to talk about today is video games, learning, and unintended consequences. And first I'd like to talk a little bit about how important learning is for video games. You may or may not have heard this name, but there's an individual named James Paul G, and he's one of the foremost authorities on learning and video games specifically. And this is one of my favorite quotes from him, where he says, "Pleasure is the basis of learning for humans, and learning is, like sex and eating, deeply pleasurable for human beings. Learning is a basic drive for humans. These pleasures are connected to control, agency, and meaningfulness." And the kind of learning that I'd like to talk about tonight is not the kind of learning that you do in school, and it's neither the kind of learning that you would get from playing pre-algebra the game, for example. When you play video games, there are a lot of different senses of learning. For example, when you play a game like this, you have to learn a lot to be able to understand how to play it and how to play it well. Even a game like this involves actually a lot of learning. And the kind of learning that I'd like to talk about tonight specifically is the kind of learning where you gain competency and autonomy through playing and practicing. So I'm basically talking about video games that involve a component of skill. And this is the same kind of learning that you experience when you participate in activities that have a component of skill. So, for example, basketball or chess or Street Fighter or rock climbing or Rock Band, whether it's the game called Rock Band or whether you're actually in a rock band and you're playing music. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that's been done about this. We know, based on the body of research that's been done, and it's called cognitive evaluation theory, that when you feel that you're competent and autonomous when you're performing whatever task you're doing, actually whether it's a video game or not, that these boost feelings of intrinsic motivation. And now what do I mean by this? Well, in Deci and Ryan's research, the way that they use these terms is they define competency as the need for challenge and the feeling of affectance. In other words, when you're competent, you feel like you can have an effect upon the world or whatever environment that you're working in or operating in. And autonomy, by that they mean a sense of volition or willingness to do a task. In other words, you decide to do the task because you want to do it. And intrinsic motivation, this is really important. I'm going to be mentioning this many times during this talk. By intrinsic motivation, what they mean is motivation based on the inherent satisfactions derived from action. In other words, if you're intrinsically motivated to do something, you like to do it just because you like to do it. It's not because somebody's going to give you a prize to do it. It's not because somebody's going to threaten you to beat you up if you don't do it. It's because you just like to do it intrinsically. So, Ryan and his academic friends have found out that games that give you this autonomous feeling also boost intrinsic motivation. So specifically, the way they say it is that provisions for choice, use of rewards as informational feedback rather than to control behavior, non-controlling instructions have all been shown to enhance autonomy, and this in turn enhances your intrinsic motivation to play the game or do whatever activity you're involved in. And at the same time, if a game teaches you competence, or if you feel like you're competent while you're playing a game, then, according to these guys, factors that enhance the experience of competence, such as opportunities to acquire new skills or abilities, to be optimally challenged, and by optimally challenged, they mean that it's the challenge is neither too hard nor too trivial, right? Because if it's trivial, then it's completely inaccessible to you. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that as well. And then, of course, to receive positive feedback, all of these things enhance the perceived competence, and in turn, also they enhance intrinsic motivation. So why is intrinsic motivation so important? Well, it's really important because if players are intrinsically motivated to play the game that you've made, they'll want to play it more often. They'll be more deeply engaged in the process of playing it. They'll be telling other players about it and how good it is. So they'll be doing advertising for you. And last but not least, they'll actually be improving themselves in small ways, yet completely important and significant ones, through the process of learning, because they're figuring out how to do things that they couldn't do before by way of the medium of the video game. And we get a whole bunch of other really, really good psychological effects in these kinds of contexts. So once again, according to Ryan and his friends, autonomy and competence predicted greater enjoyment and sense of presence and increased preference for future play. And when individuals played games where they experienced competent satisfactions, they also experienced increased vitality, self-esteem, and positive affect. So it's not really a controversy or anything. We all know that learning through video games can be very, very powerful. However, some of the common industry practices that we engage in are unintentionally damaging these aspects. They're damaging the learning experience, and in turn, they're damaging these aspects that are so good about video games. And I'm going to be talking about 4 of these things tonight. One of them is things that we do to make our games more accessible. Another one is what I'm calling stat simulation systems, which, if it's not obvious what I mean by that, it will be in a moment when I get to it. Another one is what I'm calling rubber banding systems. By the way, who knows what I mean when I say rubber banding systems? Okay, 1 person. Okay, maybe 2. Okay, so I will explain when we get to it. And also, when we do monetization via a technique that I'm calling progression tapering. And if it's not clear what that means, it'll be obvious when we get to it. And my intent here in this discussion tonight is not to tell you that, oh, okay, you should do this or you should not do this. My intention is to show you a lot of the subtleties behind these things that perhaps you may not have considered, so that when we engage in whatever practices we're engaging in when we make video games, we can do so knowing exactly what effect we're having upon the world and the effect that we're having on the people who play our games. All right, so let's talk about improving accessibility. Now, games are a really, really special medium because they challenge you in ways that no other medium can. How many people have heard of the game Battletoads? Okay, this is great because I always get more people who know about it than I ever expect it. For those of you who don't know, Battletoads is a really old Nintendo game which has a reputation for being possibly one of the most difficult games of all time. And I'm going to talk about it a little later tonight too as an example, right? So if you compare something like one of the hardest games of all time, Battletoads, to one of the most inaccessible books of all time, right? It's really like no comparison. The thing is, when any other medium is considered challenging, right? Okay, well, maybe it's heavy to carry around, or it's hard to read because you don't understand it, or it's boring. That is completely different than a game that is challenging you, because the game that is challenging you demands things from you. It demands a certain level of performance before you can really, truly, properly engage with it. And more importantly, if you don't think you can play a game, you're not going to buy it, are you? And so in this way, accessibility is actually bounding the size of your audience, which is why so many people are so interested in making games as accessible as possible. So on the face of it, yeah, more accessibility means you can have more potential customers, which can only increase your possible sales, right? So what could be bad about that? Well, the idiosyncrasies of game development tend to encourage us as game developers to come up with quick solutions to make our games more accessible. For example, a lot of times, often, you don't really understand whether you have an accessibility issue or not until you've developed your game past a certain point, right? So it's not apparent if you have to do something about accessibility or not until you've been into it for a certain amount. And of course, if your design is more original, then it's harder to notice these things as well. And of course, as game developers, right, we never have enough time to finish the things we want to do, so we're always under this enormous time pressure just to finish the game as is, not even giving any attention to accessibility one way or the other. And so what we tend to engage in a lot of times when we try to make our game more accessible or accessible enough for whatever our purpose is we do something that I like to call barrier removal. So what's barrier removal? Well, basically what I mean by that is that it's nothing more than the subtraction of elements that you identify are limiting players from progressing through your game. So here's an example that I concocted. This is not actually barrier removal because if you've played Super Mario Brothers, which is this game, these are just two screenshots from two different levels, right? But just for instance, pretend like this was the original design, right? And this is really difficult because look, you could die here, 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 here. This is really hard to negotiate. So barrier removal, even though in this case we're actually adding stuff, is us taking out the things that make the game really hard so players can progress forward. So this is common because it's really cheap to do, it's really fast to do, and it produces really obvious metric results. But you have to watch out for metrics because whenever you collect metrics about what players are doing in your game, they tell you things like what's happening, where it's happening, how much it's happening, but they never give you any information about why it's happening. To understand why certain metrics are the way they are, or why, for example, okay, so this is pretend this is a fictional game. I lifted this image over the internet. This is basically a heat map of a pretend side scroller. And what this heat map does is this is basically a collection of metrics about where are people dying in a game, okay? So where it's red, that means people are losing the most, and when it's not that color, then people are successfully, for the most part, getting past that point. So for example, right, like let's consider like this section here, right? Why might people die in a place like this all the time? Well, you don't know the reason unless you actually understand specifically what the dynamics are of what's going on in the context of your game. It's not enough to just look at the numbers. For example, in a situation like this, okay, let's say the player's going this way, right? And let's say they're falling down this slope and then they're dying here a lot. So what could be one reason? Well, maybe it's just simply because there's a challenging enemy there and it's too hard. Okay, that could be one reason. But another reason simply could be that maybe because of the way the game is constructed, maybe when they go down the slope, maybe they're like sliding uncontrollably down the slope, and maybe this is actually just a really unfair situation where they run into something and they can't do anything about it. You don't know which is which unless you understand exactly what's going on in the context of the game. So I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about an example. There's a game called The Red Star, this was the first game that I was professionally involved in. This was basically a action shooting / beat 'em up type game. And because of, once again, certain idiosyncrasies of the process that we were undergoing, we had a level that was our E3 demo level, and it morphed its way into becoming basically our first level. But by the time that we got to the point where we were considering shipping, we realized, our level 1 is way too hard. It shouldn't be that hard. So we were thinking about, okay, well, what are we going to do about this, right? Because if the first level is too hard, then no one's going to get past the first level, and no one's going to like the game, much less play it, much less want to tell their friends about it, and so on and so forth. So one thing that we considered was, well, okay, maybe we should just give everybody infinite health in the first level. That way they can get past it, and the second level is not as hard, and it doesn't take any time to do, right? We can just change one parameter, and we don't have to worry about it. Well, what we realized was, if you do that, certainly most players, if not everybody, will get to level 2, but they'll get there without having learned as much. So if you can think of the progression of a game that presents progressively more challenging situations, it's necessarily kind of like a funnel, because the group of people who are playing the game, fewer and fewer are going to be able to surmount the progression of challenges. And so what we're doing when we do something like this is, okay, well, we're making the funnel better, but only locally, right? So it's like when they get past the first level, more people are getting past the first level, but then fewer are going to get past the second level because they're less prepared to deal with the challenges that are presented in the second level. So it actually doesn't fix anything for us at all, only in a very, very local sense. It's almost like it just moves the problem from one point to the other. And so what this situation was basically barrier removal by health inflation. In other words, right, just add health until the game is easy enough. And a lot of games actually do this. The problem with doing this is that we're increasing the accessibility of the game, but we're decreasing the amount of learning that can take place necessarily. And the problem with that is that when penalties in a game are sufficiently reduced, they tend to become, after a certain point, ignored. There's certainly, you don't pay as much attention if the penalties are smaller, right? So for example, there's an old Nintendo game called Contra. Who's heard of Contra? Cool. Okay, so a little bit more people than Battletoads, right? So there's this famous code in Contra where if you put in the secret code, you get 30 lives instead of 3 lives. And certainly, when you have 30 lives to spare, you don't think as carefully about your mistakes as if you... I want to tell you about another example that's really interesting that takes a completely different approach. And some of you actually may not even be aware of this. I was never aware of this until one of the developers of this game actually told me this was going on. And I'll explain to you what I mean. So in Ratchet & Clank, this is the first Ratchet & Clank game that came out on the PlayStation 2 in 2002. Although Insomniac Games and Naughty Dog, they use this technique quite a bit in their games. And so there's a certain section in that game where what you are doing is, and this is a screenshot from it, you are basically navigating your way through this sewer that was like increasingly like ascending very slowly, and there's just like water that's like constantly rising, right? So if you're too slow, the water will overwhelm you and you will die, and so you have to go fast enough to stay ahead of the water rising. The interesting thing is that what happens is if you fail the first time and you try it again, the water actually rises more slowly. And actually, each time you fail, it will rise. You have to start over at the beginning, and yet it will rise again more slowly. And the reason why this is so interesting to me anyway is that almost nobody noticed this. And of course, you wouldn't expect to notice it, right? Because nobody will just sit there at the screen and just say, oh, okay, let me look at the water. Is it going up faster than last time or not? No, you're trying to just get out of there as fast as you can. So this is really interesting because it's a clever compromise between the two extremes. And learning in this case is only compromised or prevented if you give up because you just decide it's too hard, you don't keep trying, or if the challenge is just eventually reduced to the point where it's totally trivial, right? Because if it's totally trivial, there's nothing to learn about it to solve the problem to get out of it. And so in other words, when we do these things to improve accessibility, we're also removing the learning component of the game. And when we do this, we lose out on all of these positive motivation and retention effects that learning can have. And we also lose out on preparing players to surmount further challenges. And so the key is, in a situation like this, is that removing barriers to make things more accessible is actually completely skirting the problem. Instead of skirting the problem, what we must do is actually address the underlying problem instead of removing the underlying problem, is what we are doing. And a little bit later, I'll talk about what we can do to actually do those things. Okay, the second thing I'd like to talk about is what I'm calling statistical skill simulation. And what I mean by this is simply role-playing game style statistics in games, right? So for example, in some game you might have like a strength statistic. And that strength statistic determines basically, who you can defeat and who you can't defeat, or how easy it is or how hard it is. It's a statistic that governs the outcome versus your skill governing the outcome. And in games that have this type of dynamic, what you're doing when you're playing the game, I'm talking about grinding. Do people know what I mean by grinding? One person knows what I mean by grinding. Okay, a few people. Okay, I'll tell you in a second. Basically what you're doing when you're grinding is you're trading a time investment for an accrual of statistical power. So what do I really mean? Well, let's say there's like a role-playing game, or it doesn't even have to be a role-playing game because this is not restricted to those types of games. There's some enemy, right? And if you defeat him, you get some experience points. And so every time you defeat that enemy, you'll get more experience points. And eventually, when you get enough experience points, your statistical power goes up, right? So what have you done? You've spent time to make yourself stronger, but you haven't necessarily learned anything through that process. You've simply put in the time to do the menial work, and then the number goes up, and then the number says that you're stronger. And usually, in a lot of games, there's two components to this. Some games have only one or the other. Many games have kind of like a composite of both. So there's a lot of times, most games will, if they use these types of statistics, there's a statistical factor, like how strong that number is, right? And there's a skill factor too, which is like how well do you make the decisions you make in the game? Or how fast do you react, if it's an action game, for example. And so the statistical factor is something that's increased when you do the repetitive activity of grinding, and your skill factor is increased by you actually learning. And some games, the games that have skill factor of 0 involved, in those games learning is not possible, and it's what can be referred to as a pure grind. In other words, what you're doing, and these are two necessary components of a pure grind, is you're engaging in a repetitive and uninteresting task which increases your player agency. If it was interesting, it would not be a grind, and if it was not repetitive, then it would not be a grind. So that's what a grind is in the most pure terms. But if the game activity remains interesting, just like I said, if there's some skill factor involved, then learning is possible. And the interesting thing is that this can actually happen concurrently with repetitive game structures. Repetition is actually not bad in and of itself. Who here is familiar with the game called Puzzle and Dragons? Okay, cool, nobody. So I'll use Puzzle and Dragons as an example later on, and I'll explain to you how the game works, because it's a really interesting example. But that is one example of a game that has a lot of skill factor in it, but at the same time, it has this very repetitive structure. But there are also some really good things about grinding. One of my friends likes to say that in a game where grinding is present, it's not that you have to grind, it's that you can grind. In other words, if you're not smart enough, or if you're not skilled enough, or whatever, to figure your way out of a puzzle, what you can do is, like, let's say there's an enemy or a boss or something that's really hard, right? Well, if I can't figure out how to beat him, I can go kill these lesser enemies, which are pretty much trivial to destroy, and I can do this for an hour, or 2, or 3, or 4, until I get strong enough to pass this point. So effectively what it is, it's an alternative road to success for people who'd otherwise give up because they can't find any other way how to do it. They don't feel like they're good enough. And so what it brings with it is a promise that if you put in this amount of time, no doubt you will certainly get stronger. You are assured that with any unit of time you put in, right, you're going to get a certain amount stronger. And then you will eventually pass whatever point you can't pass. And so it's a very like reassuring feeling, because you know for sure whatever time you invest will not be lost. And it also brings it with it a promise of safety, which is that, right, grinding necessarily is kind of like a trivial kind of process, so it's low risk and it's low cognitive demand. In other words, you don't have to think very hard to do it. It doesn't make a lot of demands from you. But here's the interesting thing. When you have a game where you can either get through something by skill or get through something by just grinding, you have free choice to do either, but the very nature of the structure of the free choice biases the choice. Well, what do I mean? Well, consider, right, what I just mentioned when you grind versus a pure skill game where you don't know if you can pass the challenge. You have no idea if you're even capable of it. And secondly, it's very high cognitive demand. In other words, it's really, really taxing on you. You have to try hard. It's difficult. It might not be comfortable. And here's the thing about this, is that when you have the choice between doing this or this, what we tend to do almost all the time, I'm actually being really generous when I say there's a strong tendency, is that we will grind a lot more than we need to because, actually I'll tell you in a second why because, but even if we end up spending much more time playing the game in a way that's not pleasurable for us, we will do it anyway just to have the reassurance that we can get past this point that we are trying to get past that we can't get past right now. And so in other words, right, grinding is a way to give players a way to progress through the game and be successful while avoiding learning at the same time. And actually what grinding is it's a way for us to give players a means to remove barriers for themselves. And so in this way, it has all the same negatives that barrier removal had in the previous example. And it's really important to consider, right, we as humans, we will always take the easiest way out of things. Nobody sits in front of a game and says, well, actually, some people do, but it's like maybe 1%, right? It's maybe like only the most hardcore players will be like, oh, well, you know what? Like, I want to actually figure out this puzzle. I don't want to grind and increase the number so I can defeat the enemy and move on. I want to actually figure out the puzzle. Almost nobody will do that. Okay, so the third thing I'd like to talk about is rubber banding, or this is also called catch-up methods. So these methods are used in games like, if you've played Mario Kart, in pretty much every single Mario Kart game, this happens. In a lot of midway games, NBA Showtime is a midway game, they do this. In Mario Kart, for example, what happens is, well, let me go to this one and I'll go back. Actually, no, let me explain what this is first. For example, in Mario Kart, if you're in first place, so Mario Kart, you're racing around a track and you pick up these power-ups, and the power-ups are randomly dispensed. In other words, when you pick it up, you don't know what it's going to be. There's like a little roulette thing, and then it tells you what it's going to be in a couple seconds. Well, the way what the roulette lands on is modulated according to your position in the race. So if you're in first place, you will not get as good power-ups, not nearly as good as if you are in last place. Similarly with NBA Showtime and a lot of midway games, especially the ones where there's like a score involved, if you're on the winning team and you're leading, they will modulate the statistical outcomes of you just shooting the basket, and to make it harder, you will make baskets less frequently. It's statistically determined if you're winning. If you're losing, all of a sudden it becomes much easier to make baskets. And so, yeah, this is usually implemented in competitive games like racing or basketball, anytime there's, that kind of competition. And the reason why developers do this is they do this to make the game feel more exciting. And like I said, right, this is effectively what this is it's statistically modifying the outcomes of things behind the scenes to modulate the outcomes. And it's doing this. So we actually implemented something like this in one of the games I worked on. When I worked at THQ, when we were working on some of the Cars games, we implemented a catch-up system because we noticed that, this is how we did it. Right? So when you're winning, you race against computer vehicles in this game. You don't race against other human players. But if you're in first place, which was that place, and then sometimes place, but you will remain far ahead of the pack. And this is just a natural consequence of just the physical aspects of racing, right? Because if there's nobody in front of you to block you, you have a much easier time driving quickly through the circuit. And so what would happen a lot of times is that, maybe a player would get out in first, and then because it's easier, because they're in first, they would stay in first, and then they would be bored because it's like, oh, well, I'm in first, and I don't have to try as hard because I'm still beating everybody. And so we noticed some side effects of this type of implementation. And one of them, which is interesting, is that only performance-minded players actually really noticed. And what do I mean by that? By performance-minded, I mean if you really care about how well you're doing, right? Because if you really care about how well you're doing, you're going to pay attention to the things that affect your outcome. And if you do that, you will tend to notice, wait a minute, this guy's like suddenly faster when he wasn't. And that's kind of weird, right? Well, it's not just weird, because if it affects the outcome, you will feel cheated. To give you another example of a game that does something completely different to deal with this problem, it's a completely unrealistic solution, yet much more fair. Who's played or heard of any of the Ridge Racer games? Okay, a few. So Ridge Racer was another, it was an arcade game originally, and it's just, a car circuit racing game. And the way that they constructed Ridge Racer was that, well, when you start the race, actually, you don't start the race as you would in real life with like all the competitors next to each other on the grid. You would start the race in last place, and actually the first place car, he'd be starting the race like halfway down the track already. But what they did was they equidistantly basically spaced out all of the vehicles, all the opponent vehicles, and they kind of puppeted them around the track in a way so that they remained far apart, but that if you were good, you would eventually overtake all of them. And the thing about this, which is, even though it's completely unrealistic, it's incredibly fair because as you played the game over and over, let's say like you had like a certain skill level, which is like here, right? And you'd finish, you'd lose, or the time would run out, and you would be in like 4th place, right? Well, if with any given, with that amount of skill, you'd consistently end up in 4th place, right? If you did a little bit worse, you'd consistently end up in maybe 5th or, further down place. If you did a little bit better, you'd consistently end up in like 3rd or 2nd or 1st, right? And so it gives the player like this very reliable metric to judge themselves again, this is intrinsically motivating, right? Because you can tell that you're doing better, and you can tell when you're doing worse. In the game where you're modulating the opponent's speed artificially, like we did in Cars, all of that just goes out the window because, well, I'll tell you in a second why, right? But eventually we decided that, look, this is actually like a false problem, okay? When you reach first, even though there is a little bit of bias about being in first that makes the game slightly easier, being in first, running in first in a race is effectively a reward for you because you have proven to the game that you are good enough to pass all the other cars. And so by making the other cars faster to catch up to you, because you're in first, what it effectively is doing is it's punishing you for proving to the game that you are good enough to get into first place. And I don't think that should be a punishable offense anyway. But there's some good things about rubber banding too. So what are they? Well, what rubber banding does is it creates more frequent position changes during the competition, right? This is it's very easy to imagine how this could be so, right? Because if the guy in front's always going slower, Actually, it doesn't matter how you do it, right? If the people in behind are always made to go faster, it will tend to clump up the competition, won't it? And so competitors tend to finish closer together. And so actually, this is also a means of improving accessibility because players who are less skilled are going to enjoy greater results and more success than they would be able to otherwise if this kind of dynamic was not present. But there's some unintentional side effects with this kind of dynamic. And one of them is that it leads to a completely bizarre strategy where you don't want to be in first, right? Because if you're in first, then you're going to get penalized, so you don't want to be in first. And it's interesting actually because in NASCAR racing in the United States, this actually happens in real life because when cars race down the track in NASCAR, the drafting effect is much stronger than in any other motorsport. Drafting is like there's a car in front and one behind. If you're right behind the car, you actually go faster because there's less air resistance. And so this is what NASCAR drivers actually do. They all say there's like the 50-lap race or whatever, and they don't really try until like the last several laps because they know that being in front is a disadvantage. And the problem with this is that this is a zero-sum situation. When players who are less skilled, because they're behind, when their results are boosted, right, this is actually dampening the results of skilled players. And actually, the effects on the player depend on the mental frame of that player. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, for a certain class of players, all of these effects are strictly positive. For example, if you don't care to learn how to get better at the game, which some people don't care, and there's no reason why they have to care, this is really good for those players. If the player doesn't feel like they can get better, if they don't feel like they have competence in the game, this is a way that they can enjoy being more successful in the game. If they don't take the outcome seriously, If you're just playing for just to play it and you're not really trying to get first, this does make the game more exciting. This is also great for spectators, right? Because the results are always a lot closer. But what it does is, for performance-minded players, in other words, for players who are trying to do well and care about doing well, what this is teaching them is, hey, I just figured out, I got good enough to get into first place, and now I'm getting punished by getting into first place. And so rubber banding has a detrimental effect on learning because it's cheating. It's making everyone else behind you cheat. Right? So less skilled players are winning more often because we're adding a statistical chance of outcome to improve their result. And more skilled players are winning less often than they would otherwise. In other words, they're penalized for learning. And so games that have this structure basically create a climate where learning skill is devalued. Actually, they create a climate where skill is devalued. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about something that I call progression tapering. This is a dynamic that happens in a lot of free-to-play games, and it is a specific monetization technique. It is not a definitive component of free-to-play games. So in other words, just because you have a free-to-play game, it doesn't mean you're going to use this or have to use this, but many free-to-play games do use this. And what this is it's an algorithmic and metric-driven dynamic where statistics, as you play the game over time and progress through the game, statistics gradually, or sometimes not gradually, dominate success outcomes over time regardless of player skill. Well, what do I mean by that? Who here has heard of Candy Crush? Okay, almost everybody. So for example, Candy Crush does this. There are some levels in Candy Crush where even fairly in the beginning of the game, like I think maybe even like level 18 or 19 or something like that, you will come upon a level where if you make every single move the perfect optimal move, in other words, if you make no bad decisions, you have about a 1 in 50 chance of passing that level. And in that situation, that's a threshold point, and in other games that do the similar type of thing, you eventually, whether it's gradual or not, you reach this threshold point where you can't progress through the game by getting better at playing the game. Because the statistics, because of the way the game is structured, the statistical factors become more and more and more important in the outcome of the results of what you're playing, and your skill, right, consequently, is less of a factor. And at that point, like in Candy Crush Saga, what they do is that when you get to that level, you may realize, oh, well, I could buy this power-up, and this power-up is maybe, 99 cents or $1.99 or whatever, and it'll help me get through this level. And it just so happens that that level where you had a 1 in 50 chance of getting past, if you played it perfectly, now with this power-up, maybe that's reduced to like a 1 in 2 chance now. It allows you to progress. And so this is what we call a paywall. And there's a lot of interesting trade-offs with this paywall. There's a lot of subtleties here. The paywall and this structure in general, this is a very effective monetization technique, but it's not without its risks. Actually, one of them is that I believe that over time, because a lot of games have been using this over and over and over, people are gradually starting to figure this out, and they're becoming wise to this. So the effectiveness is this: at the beginning, when nobody knew what was going on, was very strong, and over time, the effectiveness is diminishing already, and I believe it will continue to diminish. And what are some of the other risks, right? Well, if your outcomes are being determined by statistical draw, then learning cannot take place. And even worse, right, after that threshold, what you're basically doing is you're playing a game where your only motivation to continue playing can rely upon like two things, what I'm calling loss aversion and extrinsic reward. Well, what do I mean by that? By loss aversion, I mean, right, like you've invested time into the game and you don't want to give up maybe, or maybe the game has a component where you're collecting a lot of resources, right? And this is actually used to great effect. People don't like losing things when they collect. Loss aversion, actually loss aversion is the very reason why most games that have score do not take away score from you. And it's actually, that's a very bad design, right? Because when you lose something, it feels much, much more negative than simply like what the statistical inference would imply from you not having that thing anymore, right? If you have something and you lost it, it feels much worse than if you never had it. And by extrinsic reward, I mean, right, the only reason why you're playing at that point is to like, maybe, okay, I want to get to this level that I haven't seen before, or when after I get to this other level, I'm going to get this bonus. These are extrinsic rewards, like you're getting a prize, and that's your reason for continuing, things like that, right? You're not doing it because it's fun to do. You're doing it because you're getting that carrot that's been dangled in front of you. And so what happens in these structures, right, is that you can't progress by learning or getting better or with your skill. You can pretty much only progress by purchasing this statistical power. And if this is perceived by the player, and this is very important, right? If the player doesn't perceive this, then okay, you're doing fine, right? No problem. But if the player does perceive it, and since this is becoming more commonplace, more and more people are going to be perceiving this, and they are, then people will lose their intrinsic motivation to play. It's a lot less satisfying when you get past a certain point in a game if you've done it because, you've picked up this item, than if you figured out through some means of, your own volition how to get past the part through your game. And so in summary, basically, this technique of progression tapering, well, it works, but it works for the very reason that it's limiting player progress by way of skill. In other words, it works because the game. And the problem with that is that, right, relying upon this means that repeated play by any players can't be motivated from the experience of learning. Okay, so I want to talk about Puzzle and Dragons a bit, or PAD as it's abbreviated. This, by the way, this is a really incredible game to study because not only does it have an incredible game design, but it's also one of the most strongly monetizing games in the entire world, and it also boasts one of the strongest player retention rates of any other game in the world. And I believe it's because of some of the structures that I'm going to explain here. So the core gameplay here is kind of like a match 3 type of game. Who's heard of match 3? Okay, some of you. Okay, so match 3 type of game is like this sort of thing where you have a grid of different, orbs or blocks, and you make manipulations on the board to get 3 in a row of the same color. So most match 3 games they only let you do valid moves. In other words, so the way the game works in other match 3 games, which is more commonplace, is let's say you see these 2 purple things here in this one. Well, you can move like this object here, and what that'll do is that'll push this one behind it, and it'll make 3 of these match in a row, and then they disappear, and then random orbs will fall from above. Well, in most match 3 games, and this type of game has been cloned a million times, they only allow you to make moves that result in a match. And this is bad for accessibility and for game design because there exist invalid moves. In other words, a player may try to interact with it and see that, oh, well, maybe there might be on this board maybe only 3 valid moves. If they're not smart enough to see what they are, they might try to interact with it and see nothing's going on. And even then, that just might be enough to frustrate them, and then they give up. But what they did here in this game, which is so incredible, is they said, hey, you know what? Why to limit the player? They let you take any one of these and drag it to any other position on the board without restriction. So every single position, every single move on the board is completely valid. And so in other words, right, you can take this one and move it right up here, and you can match these three, and that's a valid move, and that's how this game works. And it just so happens that the way that they devised the structure has an incredible amount of depth. There's over 100 hours of depth in the game. In other words, you can play the game for 100 hours and you can still get better and better and better at it. And I know this because I've played the game for over 100 hours. And the reason is explain here, right? So here's the extra rule that I didn't tell you about yet. Not only can you move one thing from another point, from one point to the other, anywhere, any way you like on the grid, but you have about 4 seconds, give or take, to do it. And as you do it, you might realize through the process of repetition, oh, well, when I'm moving these things, like let's say I take this heart and I move it here, here, and here, right? So I have 4 seconds. In other words, if I take more than 4 seconds, then it drops where it is automatically. But if I take less than 4 seconds and I let go, then the move is completed. When I move this here, this heart from here to here, and I'm still holding it down, this yellow one falls behind it, right? Because it has to fill up the space that was previously opened up. And likewise as I go around the board. So when this gets to here, then this one's red, this one's yellow. When this gets to here, then this one falls behind it, and I actually have 3 reds right here, and I've made a match. That's how that game works. And the thing that makes it incredible, right, is that since you have 4 seconds to make your move, you have no limit. You're limited in time, but you have no limit to how fast you can make the move. So the faster you can do your manipulations, the more manipulations you can do at once. So over time, you start being able to do, instead of just like boop, boop, crazy things like this, or crazy moves like you start here and you do this, go up here, go around, go here, blah, blah, blah. And you can make like 5, 6, 7, 8 matches at one time. And this is really satisfying. This is really cool to experience. And so in this way, right, this is a very repetitive structure. This is what you're doing over and over and over. But it's not repetitive like grinding is repetitive because it's interesting. It's not trivial. And you can always see a way that you can do it just a little bit better because you can do it just a little bit faster than last time. This kind of repetition is like repetition, in basketball. Like you're just shooting your basketball into a hoop, right? That's the most repetitive activity you can think of, but nobody ever thinks of basketball as being like a repetitive activity, do they? Because you're always learning. Every time you repeat the activity, you're always learning a little bit new about it. And so this is a fantastic example of a game as a teacher. Because just by virtue of getting practice in the game, it's very easy for people to notice what else they can do to do it a little better. And another thing that's interesting is that in this same system, right, we also have a dynamic at work that's disrupting learning. And that's because when you make matches, right, like I said a minute ago, so you've created empty space when you make a match. So there's gravity, so the orbs will fall to fill up that empty space, and any additional empty space left at the top will be filled in by random orbs falling from the top. But because the orbs are falling randomly from the top, what that does is it arbitrarily scrambles the difficulty of the state of the board from one move to the next, because it's random. So the difficulty of the board for you to make new matches gets randomly harder or easier as the game goes on with each move you make. And so in turn, what that results is that your agency in the game, in other words, how well you can affect the outcome of the game, can really dramatically change from move to move, right? From one moment it seems like, oh, I'm having a really easy time. Another moment, even though it was maybe just 3 moves later, all of a sudden it feels like it's impossible. And it is impossible. And so the thing about this is that when anytime a statistical component in the outcome of a game overpowers the player's skill component, what it does is it's basically teaching the player that, okay, your skill didn't matter, right? Because your skill was not able to determine the outcome of the game. It was the random factor that did so. And when you notice this as a player, you will lose your intrinsic feeling of wanting to play the game, right? It's not intrinsically rewarding anymore because there's nothing, you feel like there's nothing you can do about the outcome personally. And so what this means is that players who do play the game for intrinsically motivated reasons, well, those players, if there's too much of this going on, they'll tend to give up, right? Because it's like, well, I'm playing a slot machine now. They're going to feel like they're playing a slot machine, and they don't want to play a slot machine. Some people like to play slot machines, and for them this is fine. But for those who play for skill, they will not want to play these games anymore, and they will actually feel tricked, because what they did was they started with a skill game, and then what they ended up with was a slot machine. All right, so now I want to talk briefly about... Okay. Another completely more extreme example, which is Battletoads, right? So Puzzle and Dragons was a very accessible, very deep game. Battletoads is a very deep game that's very inaccessible. And I want to use the third level of Battletoads as the example, and I'll explain to you what's going on here so you can understand the context. So here's some screenshots from the game, right? In this third level, you ride like one of these little things, and this is actually one screen here, okay? So you can't see very far ahead of you, and these obstacles are appearing from the left at a very high rate of speed. And this is a map of the level, so you can see what kind of obstacles you encounter. Basically, all you do is, you can take the upper position or the lower position. And so when there's a wall here, you want to go down. When there's a wall here, you want to go up, down. And then sometimes there's something like you have a jump button, so you can jump. You have to jump over this one. But then when one of these appears, you have to avoid pressing jump. And anyway, these things come at you so fast that you have about, this whole level is about maybe like a 2-3 minute sequence at very, very high speed. And it comes at you so fast, your visibility is so limited that effectively you're forced to rely upon muscle memory and memorize what's going to happen so you have any chance of avoiding it. In other words, the first time you play, you will never get past it. You will never get past it the first 10 or 20 times you play because you have to memorize each piece of it, because every time you hit the obstacle, you have to start over at the beginning. And so you're forced to learn through brute force, trial and error, and you have to rely upon your muscle memory. And the only way you can surpass this level is if you have already mastered it, right? In other words, it's like at any point before total mastery, you are not rewarded at all. And this is why Battletoads is such a hardcore, difficult, inaccessible game. And this is just as bad as what I talked about at the beginning, where games where if we make them so accessible that we just let everybody through, right? I mean, that's just like an art gallery. Like, there's no component of learning there. There's no component of skill involved, effectively, in the most extreme situations. And this is just the opposite, but this is really bad too. At the very least, the only people that this is really good for is a type of player, and these players are in the minority, is people who have a very, very high level of self-determination, who are very, very stubborn, who will absolutely not accept defeat, and they will sit there for 20 hours and do it over and over again until they win. But the good thing about that is that players who are willing to put themselves through that and are not daunted by that, they feel a really great sense of satisfaction when they finally do overcome that challenge. Is not just getting more people through your game. What real accessibility is teaching people how to get through the game better, rather than just moving the goalposts so that they just get through it better no matter what. Here's a few techniques that people use, developers use, in order to accomplish this. Has anybody heard of the term telegraph in terms of like game mechanics? Okay, I'll explain. What a telegraph is, like let's say you're playing an action game, and let's say there's an opponent and it's like a tank or something, and it's going to shoot a bullet at you and it's going to fire at you. Well, a telegraph is like some kind of effect on the muzzle of the cannon, some kind of maybe a particle effect or something that makes sense within the context that says, hey, something's going to happen here, watch out, right? It's a means of communication. What's going to happen so that they're better equipped to deal with it. It's communication is what it is. And of course, using a repetition structure like in Puzzle and Dragons can also very easily afford giving players a route to achieve learning and mastery, right? But you want to do it in a gentle way. Puzzle and Dragons does it in a gentle way. Battletoads does it in a really brutal way, which is, right, if you make one little mistake, boom, you start all over. And it's also really important in these situations, right, if you want to do this, that you have to have in your game mechanics a sufficient latitude of skill in your game actions versus a statistical draw. In other words, you have to have some kind of dynamic with the mechanics. It can't just be simply determined by computation of statistics. And another thing that's really important to teach people depth, and this is part of being gentle about things, is that you want to very gradually increase demands upon the player, right? This is actually just like school, right? What do they do in school, right? They teach you one thing, like how to add. They don't teach you how to multiply first. No, they teach you how to add first. Multiplication builds upon addition, and so on and so forth, right? Every single little thing you learn, the next thing you learn builds upon that previous thing. And this is how good games that teach people well and communicate with them well and make more players play them better, accomplish this. And here's another really interesting too. The way that you construct your dynamics, how you choose to design your mechanics of your game, actually necessarily impacts how learnable your mechanics are. And this is actually something that nobody has figured out completely. It is possible to figure out, and whoever figures this out first will be able to make games like Puzzle and Dragons on that level of success on a consistent basis. Because if you study the mechanics in Puzzle and Dragons, right, it's just an intrinsic aspect of the way those rules are set up that makes it really easy to learn how to get better, and it feels really good. There's other games where they're just simply hard to learn. And if you can figure out the difference between those two, you will figure out something that no one else has been able to figure out, which is like how to make a lot of money consistently with any video game you put out. All right, so in conclusion, right, games that are designed better are actually better teachers. As a game designer, what you are is you're a teacher, and what you're doing is you're teaching the player, whether you like to or not, invariably you are, and whether you do it well or not, invariably you are teaching your players, you're communicating with them how to surmount the challenges in your game. And as a designer, you have a grave responsibility, which is that it's your job to teach players how to get through the game, how to play the game, through the medium of the game, through the grammar that you have for the game. Because if you fail to teach them, you will fail to keep them. If you have accessibility without depth, that means that we can't take advantage of all these good things about learning to motivate and retain our players. But if you have depth without accessibility, it means you're not being a good teacher. And what that means is that you're reliant upon the player to figure it out for themselves, and only the most hardcore players will be able to figure it out, and those will be the minority of the people who could possibly play your game, and you're limiting, everything about the possible audience for your game. And so both of these things are critical to produce maximally effective games. And by maximally effective, I mean maximally effective in all aspects. Sales, popularity, not the least of which is the kind of psychological and cultural effect you're having on the players who play your game, and how they're feeling about it after they play, and how they're feeling about whether they can accomplish things or not, and whether they feel that they can learn their way through things. Okay, so I hope that I've been able to show you guys tonight how learning is really important to engagement and retention in games, and how, by using some of these techniques we've used a lot, we've unintentionally diminished the component of learning, and how understanding some of these subtleties a little bit better can help us make better games in all aspects. So thank you, Shinorak Alem. I think we're going to do questions now, question and answer. I'm not sure who's got the microphone. Yeah, any questions? Ayo.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Jora.
Hi there.
I've noticed that there's a recent trend to make games harder. Like, if you have seen the success of games like Dark Souls or whatever from
I was
software
thinking
is
of
making,
exactly that one.
Is it a general trend that if it's successful and no matter how hard it is, people will play that? Game designers will tend to continue making such games?
I don't think it's a general trend. I just think it's kind of like a little bit of a backlash from the previous trend, which is just making games easier and easier and easier until everyone can go through them. Like Dark Souls is kind of like, I think, a special case, because I think what happened in that situation is that a hole had opened up in the market, which is that so many games went so far toward being more accessible by doing things like barrier removal, that we were left with a population of gamers that were really unsatisfied with a lot of games, and then Dark Souls came out. And so that game found its audience. So I think it's more a result of that than necessarily a continuous trend.
Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, my
Hi.
name is Vem.
How are you?
Do you think when you start a game and you make the game and people are trying it out, you should force them to pass the tutorial first and learn how to play your game and enjoy it a lot? Or when they're playing it, you give them hints and they can, without reading them, they can just guess and pass through, and in the future not pass through? Which option is better?
That's great. That's a fantastic question. Tutorials are, it's a funny thing. I'm going to try to answer this succinctly instead of spending an hour, because I actually have another talk where I talk about this for like an hour. Here's the thing, right? This is an old Nintendo game, but have you played a game called Metroid? No? Okay. You might want to look it up. Metroid is a really interesting example, right? Before the days where we had explicit tutorials, what we had to rely upon is actually teaching the player the game in the few levels of the game, like as the game itself. There was never, in a lot of the older Nintendo games, there was never like, okay, now you're doing the tutorial, okay, now you've learned enough, okay, now you can play the game, right? The bad thing about that is that the tutorial doesn't feel like you're playing the game. The tutorial feels like somebody's making you read a bunch of stuff you want to read and do a bunch of things that are not the game. It's just not fun, right? The proper way to teach the player the game is to teach them in the game where the tutorial, so to speak, is actually just the beginning of the game where, for example, you have a small challenge and then a little harder challenge on top of that and a little harder challenge on top of that, and so on and so forth. And so the best way to teach the player your game is not to do an explicit tutorial, and don't tell them, hey, it's the tutorial, right? Just let them play the game, but design your game in a gradual way so that you learn each thing one by one. The reason why Metroid is such a great example is that if you really look at, like literally, the first 3 screens of the game, which is about 30 seconds of gameplay, they actually teach and test you many things sequentially, and most people aren't even aware of it. And it's beautiful, right? Because you don't feel like somebody's teaching you something, you're just playing the game, and you didn't realize that you've actually learned these things. And the beautiful thing about having this kind of progression is that once a player reaches a certain point, like let's say there's a ledge, right? And the player jumps up here, okay? Well, you know, if the player has to jump up to the ledge, you know that if the player has reached this point, you know that they know how to do this. They've proven it to you. So now you can build upon that. You can say, okay, now you have to jump, but maybe you have to jump on maybe a moving platform or something. See? That's the best way to do progression. Yeah, short love hearts there. Merci. Any other questions?
Hi, Ara.
Hi.
Quick question about people's choice of learning versus the difficulty level they actually choose. Because you talked a bit about, because a lot of games have an easy mode, sort of, let's go to a medium or a normal mode, and a hard mode, and a maybe extremely hard mode. Mm-hmm. What is the general breakdown of players, and what do they generally choose to start with, and where do they go? Because I mean, it seems a bit of a counterintuitive thing to choose an easy mode if actually people want to learn and they want to have a hard game.
This is also a really interesting question, because depending on how that choice is framed to the player will determine what they will tend to choose, and also how the player feels about themselves will determine which one they choose. For example, I have a friend who, he's not that good at games, okay? But he can't bring himself to choose easy. Right? Because he's like, no, I'm above that. No. And actually, like, I don't think he can even bring himself to choose like medium or like normal, right? No, he's got to play on hard. Even though it's actually, he has a worse time doing it, right? He always picks that, right? So that's like an internal thing. So some people have just internal biases when they're presented with the choice. Sometimes the way the words, like which words are chosen, right? Like easy, like normal. What's normal, right? Easy, medium, hard versus like, I don't know. Sometimes like a lot of games get a little bit more stylized with the words, and it's not as like clear what it means. But the interesting thing about that is, yeah, like if you say you're on easy mode, not just my friend who's a freak of nature, but a lot of people don't want to choose easy because it's like, well, oh, this is easier than it should be, right? And so sometimes people end up actually choosing a choice that's inappropriate for them, and they don't even realize it. Did that answer the question?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Any more questions? Matet Vereva.
First of all, thanks for interesting presentation. My name is Arman. The question is regarding to is there any specific techniques for VR games, like the level design for VR? Because, you know, it's difficult for the users to play too long because their eyes are tiring and they do not want to do. So is there any specific advice for designing that type of games?
That's really interesting. I haven't actually considered that before. So I'm just going to make up an answer based on what I know about VR, I guess. I mean, I guess the only real implication would be, right, I mean, you don't want somebody to be in the game for too long a period of time. So the only really complication there is whatever you're doing, whatever it is, should be accomplished within whatever the limit of that time constraint is before people get tired. That's really the only thing I can think of that would be a factor. Otherwise, I think everything else is probably the same. Another thing that might be involved, and I'm just speculating about this, depending on what the VR technology is like, right? Like, some people have different, assuming that the VR technology has a greater range of view than that extends past certain people's peripheral vision, that might be a factor, but I know like Oculus isn't that much, so that wouldn't be a factor. Yeah, I mean, I can only speculate as far as that goes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thanks for the presentation. I would like to ask, what do you think about the games that just straight up put you into the game and give no tutorials or hints at all? Like Minecraft, for example, it's mainly based on the research the player does outside of the game.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that you brought up Minecraft as an example, right? Because that game is like enormously popular, right? Like not having a lot of devices to teach the player things has certainly not had a detrimental effect on its popularity or its success. I think the thing is about Minecraft, it lends itself so easily to, part of it is it lends itself easily to exploration, but another part of it is that there is so much hidden knowledge and depth to it that the effect that has is that it gets people talking about it, you know? Like secrets are really important in games because like if you figured out a secret, then you're like, oh, you're going to tell your friends about it. And I think one of the reasons that game became so popular is because like it had so much like hidden knowledge about how things worked that really fostered a lot of interpersonal communication about it. And like everybody felt like they were like figuring out things they weren't supposed to know. You know, that's like a really cool feeling thing. So my guess is that that's what it was.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Microphone.
Thanks. The dragons and what? The
Puzzle and Dragons.
Puzzle and Dragon. Do you think they lucked out, or did they know what they were doing?
Interesting. I think it's impossible to really know. I think that the most we can say is that I think it's impossible to know if they knew what they were doing from the start, right? Like they just planned like, oh, we're going to make this change to the normal match 3 dynamic and it's going to be huge. What I think is not an accident for sure is that I think I'm almost certain that once they stumbled upon that particular combination of mechanic, I think they knew how good it was going to be. That's just my guess. But once again, they may not have known that either. It's just speculating. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
It's sort of kind of related to the game that Pego mentioned, where there's a random element in the game. Is there some kind of code of ethics for developers where they're not really allowed to make really evil decisions? For example, Zoomer Blitz or Bejeweled Blitz.
Yeah.
If I were to make it and I was trying to maximize money, what I would do is give the players the impression of giving them random selections when you actually clear the board. But what I would actually do is monitor how well players actually finish a given level after like a million games, and then you actually monitor how someone plays, so that if they're failing, you start giving them easy, random selections, and then when they get past a certain level, you give them harder random selections, and they keep on progressing, so you basically keep them hooked into the game, which is kind of like a really evil practice that,
well, I think there's a continuum of manipulations you can make to your game, and they can go from being very evil to not evil at all. For example, I think making the game, it really just depends on the precise context, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail right now. But like, for example, training the player that the cancel button is on the left side and the buy button is on the right side, and then switching it around when they've grown accustomed and their muscle memory has learned that to click the other button and they accidentally click something to buy something, that's on this side of the continuum, right? Because what did you do? You taught the player something and then you tricked them, right? So that I think is, okay, that's probably pretty evil, but here's the thing about that, is that in a way, at least over time, I think that these types of things have a self-balancing effect, because what's happened in the free-to-play space, this is happening gradually, and I think it will continue to happen over time more and more, is that the more obvious tricks and the more evil tricks that developers are using, players are becoming wise to, right? They're learning to. They're learning to avoid them. They're becoming resistant against them, right? And so they're going to work less and less well over time. And so the thing that makes me not worry or even care so much about however evil anyone wants to make a game is that, look, I mean, you could do that. You could trick a player, and you can tell yourself it is or it isn't tricking, whatever, and it'll work for a while, right? But these kinds of things that I'm talking about here, right, where if we do things that like really help the player learn better and feel really good about what they're doing, you're going to get the great result out of the game, and players are not going to feel remorseful about having played the game, and that can only be good, you know? It's just, okay, I guess it's harder to accomplish. That's the only flip side to it, you know? Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much, guys. I'll hang out up here for a little bit if anyone wants to come say hi. If there's any like game developers in the room that are local here, I would really love to meet you. Thanks again.